Hello, good morning to everyone. Tatjana Hodnik is my name, actually coming from the University of Ljubljana Faculty of Education, working in the area of didactics of mathematics. And I will be your chair for this morning. We have three presenters, three topics, and we agreed together with the participants, with presenters, to have presentations first and then discussions which will follow each presentation. So you are kindly invited to send your questions in chat or maybe say it out loud after each presentation. We will keep, track, so it will be about 20 minutes presentation and about 10 minutes for discussion. And I think it's time to start. And I'm going to invite our first presenters. So Vasileios Symeonidis and Evi Agostini to start with a presentation titled "Lessons Learned: the UE Responses to Educational Dilemma During the COVID-19 Pandemic." So the floor is yours. Please start.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this session. So we are going to present to you an article that we have been working on about the European Union's discourse following the COVID-19 pandemic. We have slightly adjusted our original title, focusing on the responses for education recovery during the COVID-19 pandemic. And my name is Vasileios Symeonidis. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Graz, and we work together with Denis Francesconi from Aarhus University and Evi Agostini from the University of Vienna to this article and this presentation. So to give you an overview of the things we are going to discuss, if we can move to the next slide. We will first talk about the back of our thesis, so of the study, and then I'm going to give you a theoretical overview of the things we discussed, and we move to presenting the methods, findings, and concluding remarks. So starting with the background, we all experience that COVID crisis is a systemic crisis, and it has created one, probably the largest disruption of education systems in history. It has impacted approximately 1.6 billion learners in more than 190 countries and in all continents. And while the pandemic is still hitting large parts of the world, it's stated that COVID has sharpened the precarious economic and social situation of millions of people all around the globe. Some initial analysis and indication about its effects on the education systems have already been proposed. In Europe, for example, some conservative estimates for a few selected European countries consistently indicate that the students will face a non-symmetric learning loss with long-term consequences as a result of the pandemic. This learning loss is defined as less time spent in online learning settings compared to in-class learning settings, increased stress, poorer social interaction, and lack of learning motivation. And in order to mitigate some of these negative effects, several EU member states provided support, mostly to enhance the digital skills of teachers and students, as well as to provide suitable access devices and pathways to alternative connection means. As it is expected, these effects of the pandemic have also reached at the level of the European Union, which has been called upon to provide a concerted answer to this crisis, in view especially of establishing the European education area by 2025. And although the initial reactions of the DG for Education and Culture was limited to the provision of online materials for learning, the European Commission itself has introduced the European Skills Agenda and the Digital Education Action Plan as measures to improve the resilience of the education systems and to increase the use of digital technology and learning among member states. It becomes crucial for the EU, and this is also was the starting point for writing this paper, for the survival of the European political project is crucial to provide a common response towards education recovery and not to get stuck in this prolonged phase of introspective self-examination that the EU is usually faced. And especially in a context where these fundamental values of the European Union, which is built on unity and borderlessness, are challenged, the question that is raised is, can the European political project be relaunched in a process of a new paradigm, for example, a new social Europe, where the fabrication of the European space of education plays a decisive role? So, moving to the aim of this article is to study the EU's education policy discourse and promoted narratives since the outbreak of the COVID pandemic. We draw from an organizational theory approach, and our objective is to disassemble and critically on recovery, considering, of course, that the European Union has rather soft legal competence on education policy in member states. The study does not directly seek to define implications for member states, but rather examines if this COVID pandemic has led the EU to rethink some of its education priorities, for example, towards social and ethical dimension. And we hope that in doing so, we contribute to the body of literature that has emerged the last year about the impact of COVID, illustrating the perspective of a supranational entity like the EU. Giving you a bit of a conceptual framework background, we know that the EU's role in education is not binding like in other areas of policy. But since the Lisbon Council in 2000, we know that the European cooperation in education developed, especially with the launch of the so-called open method of coordination, which is a particular learning-based form of governance, one could say, or Europeanization, which could lead to convergences towards the European Union goals and ultimately to Europeanization without the need to create a new legislation. Since in this area of education, the subsidiarity principle applies. And despite, so the OMC, this open method of coordination, we know it operates through peer learning activities, through council guidelines, benchmarking, etc. And despite the deficiencies that sometimes are identified in this instrument, it has been argued that it represents a shift in education and training by promoting this more neoliberal notion of education for the economy with more limited space for a dimension of social Europe. So through this OMC, it makes sense to talk about the emergence of a so-called European education space or European education policy developed within particular historical, economic, political contexts, which allow education to find its place in European policy. So based on this idea of a distinct European education policy, Evi will now present to you a conceptual model for the interpretation of the EU's policy discourse on education recovery during the COVID pandemic. Evi?
Thank you, Vasilis. So I'm going on with an organizational theory perspective. So our conceptual framework to analyze the ability to respond or the responsibility of an international entity such as the EU is based on organizational theory, because responsiveness has proven not only to be a crucial individual ability, for example, in a phenomenological perspective, but also an organizational capability. Therefore, Gärtner and colleagues define responsiveness as, quote, acting an act of sensing, seizing opportunities, and reconfiguring organizational resources and routines, end of the quote. So to make a long story short, in the context of our study, it is important to understand that responsiveness is not just developed inside an organization, but it creates value in a network of stakeholders as well as in a certain environment, and must therefore also address different logics of action in order to respond adequately and as requested also to the crisis COVID-19 pandemic. So in that sense, the EU as a particular supranational institution has to respond to norms, to regulations of the context, as well as to the claims of its stakeholders, for example, the member states, especially as already Vasileios mentioned when it comes to soft EU policy actions. And Gärtner and colleagues explain the process of responsiveness in different dimensions. To illustrate these 4 dimensions, they present them in a graph. You can see it on the slide. Responsiveness starts with a process of sensing in the form of giving meaning to perceptions, for example, seizing something in our context of the pandemic, COVID-19, as opportunity or threat, followed then by a certain way of reacting to the pandemic. And both of these actions are influencing change, and then the final element is gaining legitimacy, that it leads to more legitimacy. So adopting this theoretical concept of responsiveness proposed by Gärtner and colleagues in our empirical study, the primary units of analysis are selected policy documents. So sensing, reacting, influencing, and also taking responsibility and gaining legitimacy. They are, of course, closely connected to each other, but in an analytical perspective, they have to be analyzed separately from each other. So responsiveness needs to be seen as a second order construct consisting of the first order components just mentioned. And we also define some indicators for these dimensions for our study, and you can also see them on the slide. So sensing would be that the EU collects information and frames meaning. The main meaning would be education recovery. Then in the dimension of reacting, it would be that the EU within the education sector and the main policy documents, we can see that there have been some kind of acceleration in the same direction. Then with influencing, we can see that the EU adopts a specific discourse with the attempt to influence national policies. And the last dimension would be taking responsibility and gaining legitimacy. And we can, or we will show you that the EU only supports certain narratives and hides others. So in our interpretive discourse analysis, the responsibility of the EU is shown by whether all dimensions of responsiveness have been passed through and to what extent the different demands, claims, needs, and logics of others have been taken into account. And so to analyze the responses of the EU with regard to education recovery during the COVID-19 pandemic, we combine discourse analysis with computer-assisted content analysis. So computer analysis was used to track the frequency of particular words across texts, helping us to identify relevant patterns, which while discourse analysis allowed us to interpret these patterns in a wider social context. And first we ran a search for EU law documents offered by the European Commission during the year 2020 with the terminology COVID and education as title and in-text keywords. And second, we selected 4 documents as relevant responses of the EU to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in education and training. And table 1 shows the list of the selected policy documents for this study. And with the assistance of the software Max Collier, then a single word frequency search was conducted across the data set. And also a word combination search was conducted with 2 and 3 words respectively. And a first effort to group patterns into analytical categories resulted in 5 and then in 3 discursive bundles following an inductive content analysis. And as shown in table 2, the main analytic categories captured the EU's policy discourse on education recovery as upskilling and reskilling, as digital transformation, and as sustainable development.
Okay, and I can move on with presenting, starting with the results section. So the first category identified was education recovery, so upskilling and reskilling. The word skills was the 3rd most frequent word that appeared in our frequency search across all the documents examined, and usually when the specific word was combined with another one, the most frequent results were digital skills and skills agenda. And of course, it is not surprising to think that the EU places such a strong emphasis on skills when it comes to describe actions for education recovery, since the European interest on education originates from pressures of the employment area, and the EU often extends the scope of employment policies to other aspects belonging to the education sector. So from the moment of the Lisbon Council in 2000, reframing education policies to foster a knowledge economy, education has been assigned with this more monolithic role of providing flexible and up-to-date workforce. And this also becomes the case here. We see this discourse further promoted. So following the COVID pandemic, whereby education appears to be means for upskilling and reskilling a competitive workforce that can in turn contribute to Europe's economic recovery and social prosperity. And to this end, the EU has utilized or launched several financial schemes with this next generation EU reaching up to 750 billion euros. This discourse on skill is framed by the broader context and the umbrella of lifelong learning and social fairness, which shows here this kind of dilemma. So this kind of challenge between this cohesion policy and the more economic priorities of the European Union. Skills and lifelong learning are presented to be the drivers of the Union's ambition for a green and digital transition. And this so-called balancing act between the objectives of the lifelong learning policy and the cohesion policy seem to have also been crystallized in the so-called European skills agenda as a benchmark, whereby by 2025, 14 million adults with low qualifications in Europe should participate in learning every year.
Kind reminder, you have 2 minutes left.
2 minutes, but we started a little bit later. And I mean, if it's okay with the 30 minutes to talk 20-25 minutes and then have 5 minutes for discussion, please. So, okay, I will be a little bit faster, talking now about the second pattern, which we identified education recovery as digital transformation. So in that sense, we see that the COVID appears as a learning opportunity because it accelerated the digital transformation process in education. Similar to the previous category, we see again the idea of cohesion here, that this digital leap should not leave anyone behind. So the idea of social fairness is included and is trying to balance this more economic oriented approach, but still at the core of digital education program lies the idea of discourse around flexible skills and around competencies. So digital education, and in that sense, the development of digital skills, should contribute to digital literacy and resilience, with emphasis placed on promoting digital technologies to support teaching and learning processes. And in a way, these ideas are legitimized considering the EU soft policy with the so-called international outreach. So by doing this, the Union becomes more competitive and has a bigger, so to say, international influence and international outreach. And of course, in that area, the role of teachers is particularly important. The teaching workforce needs to update their digital skills. Our final category is related to sustainable development. And we can see that when the EU talks about the digital transition, it also talks about the green transition. And here we have, we have a strive towards sustainable development that, like the previous category, should foster the acquisition of skills, the acquisition of competencies. Again, here, this idea is framed by the lifelong learning perspective and the objectives of economic growth, social cohesion, and environmental protection. And it's interesting to note that this idea of promoting sustainability is connected to the visions or the competencies, so to say, of entrepreneurship and innovation, with the role of universities here being particularly crucial. And of course, we have more and more the idea of greener mobility, so that programs such as the Erasmus should provide greener mobility opportunities, and physical mobility should be carbon friendly. And Evi will close up with some concluding remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Vasileios. With this slide, or with this table, I just want to give you a short overview on how selected policy actions in the EU constitute higher or lower degrees of responsiveness by reproducing, we would say, distinctive narrative of education, recovery as upskilling and reskilling, digital transformation and sustainable development. So we would say that in a critical and interpretive analysis of the selected policy document, the facets of the narrative all appear to orientate towards economic priorities, gaining legitimacy only from the employment area and taking responsibility, especially for improving Europe's economic competitiveness. So in this perspective, the EU constitutes a low degree of responsiveness insofar as the propagated slogans of resilience, inclusion, participation, sustainability for the world of all are not specifically unshot in binding regulations. That just in a few words, and now I'm coming to the concluding remarks. So to sum up, the COVID-19 pandemic is an experimentum crucis to evaluate the ability of organizations to respond to unforeseen crises. However, all core narratives invoke the shift to a neoliberal concept, such as already outlined by Vasileios, such as skills, competences, and education is meant to be individually acquired as skills, and not it's not seen as related social responsibility. So it's only mentioned in the policy document, but not elaborated. And what is almost completely missing is the reference to a broader humanistic role of education. So instead of finding or creating new answers to educational issues, all topics have been used in the context of COVID-19. For these reasons, for us, it seems to be even dangerous to leave untouched the logics and frameworks from which the EU policies derive. So the lessons to be learned from a radical systemic crisis like this one should be themselves radical and systemic. So thank you very much for your attention, and we are looking forward to your questions and comments.
Yes, thank you very much to both of you, Evi and Vasileios. So now if you have questions, I don't see any remarks or questions in the chat section. So please, some comments. Yes, please, Marco.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation and well, giving this overview of developments and rhetorics and policies on the European level. I was wondering to what extent your conclusion that the focus is mainly on the economic part and not so much on the social agenda of Europe could be explained by the fact that the European Commission has a very limited role on the area of education. So they have to be very careful in putting topics on the agenda. And I can imagine that especially those more humanistic and social agenda might be a very sensitive one to tread into from the perspective of the European Commission.
Thank you very much, Marco, for this question. And the thing is that you're obviously right. I mean, you participate in some of those working groups. The thing is that the EU, well, claims to try to improve the policy cooperation in education. And I mean, the role of establishing also a European education area in a few years from now also indicates this idea of strengthening the member states' collaboration in areas of education and training. And in our case, we considered, and not only us, but that the COVID as a kind of opportunity to rethink priorities of education, maybe shifting away from these strictly economic principles towards more ethical ideas, or promoting more the idea of social Europe, for example, which is also claimed by the European Pillars of Social Rights since 2017. So there is this discourse promoted, and we consider that education can play a role in reimagining Europe towards this more social vision. And the COVID pandemic in that sense could play a role in doing that. And this was in a way our hypothesis, which of course we can say was not confirmed, because okay, we see again that the same kind of discourses are promoted and reproduced. So that's why we ask, are the lessons learned? However, we see that there is this balance envisaged between social fairness. So the documents talk about this all the time, and promoting inclusiveness, etc. So there is obviously here some influences of this more social idea, more social role of Europe, but it's not strongly promoted, or at least it's not promoted as much as we would wish this to be promoted, to think of education not only in economic terms, but also in a more pedagogic, building-oriented ways. And hope that until 2025, perhaps these discussions can emerge, and COVID proves to be the opportunity to talk about this role of European education policy and European education space.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? For me, it was really interesting, that the word skills, appeared the most times. But yes, Fjolla, please, I give you the floor first.
Thank you very much, Professor Hodnik. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really interesting to actually hypothesize that COVID might actually bring education in Europe together, or ensure this Europeanization even further, which is, I think, quite bold and interesting as a hypothesis. And I just wanted to actually ask about teacher education specifically. I know that your area of research is does also concern the Europeanization of teacher education. So I wanted to know whether you have found something in specific to teacher education. We know that usually when we want to understand how Europeanization influenced teacher education and even initial teacher education, different research suggests that it's usually national concern, and it's sometimes quite difficult to actually influence. this dimension. So did you find anything maybe more specifically in this regard? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. And yes, I mean, our interest here focused mainly on the broader education discourse. There was not something in those documents, I mean, specifically, or at least has not been produced to our knowledge, something particular about teacher education following the COVID from the EU policy perspective. But of course, when it comes to promoting policies in these documents, like the skills agenda or the digital education plan, the teachers and their professional development, their education is mentioned. And if I had a little bit more time, I would talk about that in the skills section that we see again when it comes to teachers, for example, or teacher education. The ideas promoted also there are competencies and skills of teachers, digital skills that need to be updated. So many teachers were lacking this kind of skills, and the idea here promoted in those documents was to develop this kind of digital competencies, this kind of digital skills. So again, we talk about competencies, which is something the EU usually does, but in a very neutral way. So we don't, so competencies to measure teacher performance or competencies to assist actually their professional development. This is not clear. But yeah, there are a few mentions about teachers and about teacher education, and this mainly promote to the competencies towards digital and also sustainable development. And obviously, yeah, quality assurance again is mentioned quite often, which again reflects and has implications for teacher education institutions, and also this idea perhaps of mobility and promoting again mobility, greener mobility, something also influencing students, teacher students, and also staff, since it has implications for the Erasmus program. Thank you for the question.
Yes, thank you very much. Now we have to give time of the floor for that. Thank you very much once more, Evi and Vasileios, for your very interesting presentation. What I wanted to say before was like skills in relation to knowledge. I mean, this is also my concern, something, you know, we speak a lot about the skills, but I will give now the opportunity for our next presenter to share with us the research findings. Fjolla Kaçaniku, please present your findings titled Conceptualizing Quality Initial Teacher Education, taking stock of the new context. Please.
Thank you very much. Professor Hodnik, I think you can see my screen now. So, hi everyone, I'm Fjolla Kaçaniku. I'm teaching at the University of Pristina at the Faculty of Education, and I'm also a PhD candidate at the University of Ljubljana Faculty of Education. Today I'm going to present just some preliminary findings of a current research on conceptualizing quality initial teacher education and trying to take stock of this new context. This is the background of the presentation. I will provide a bit of background on this new changing context. I'll discuss a bit on the Kosovo context, research purpose and research questions, a bit about the methodology, findings, and at the end I'll try to provide or attempt to theorize this new context in which we would conceptualize quality initial teacher education and offer some conclusions. So although on the background of changing educational systems and this pressure and the need to transform due to COVID-19, I think it goes without saying that all of us have faced this, and either in a bigger framework of higher education institutions or pre-university education or teacher education specifically, there was an immediate pressure to transform and actually rethink the actually approach that we would use to developing future teachers. And definitely this also concerned initial teacher education and also initial teacher education institutions. So more importantly, my topic concerns the question of how to ensure quality initial teacher education at the policy dimension, at the institutional organization dimension, as well as at the classroom dimension. A bit on the Kosovo context. Kosovo is a small and peripheral European context. Initial teacher education developed at the university level in 2002. And although initial teacher education in Kosovo was influenced greatly by the EU-funded projects and different European frameworks and agendas in efforts to develop quality teachers and raising teacher professionalism, still we can see in the research side as well as in the practical side that there are a lot of inner tensions as to what do we consider quality teacher development. This is reflected at the teacher educators practice as well as at the program design and delivery. So the purpose of this study is to examine how quality initial teacher education in Kosovo is conceptualized in this changing context of teacher preparation. By the changing context, I'm highlighting the changing context of preparing teachers during this pandemic time, which means teacher education transfer to an online context. And if we try to conceptualize this, would we say that there are different ways that we do understand quality teacher development? Although this understanding or conceptualizing quality teacher education within a bigger European framework is part of my dissertation, I only wanted to ask or actually go back to the participants and try to understand how would they conceptualize quality initial teacher education in this changing context during the pandemic. So that's why maybe the sample size here is smaller because the participants, when they participated in the study, they were asked about the bigger understanding or a more general understanding of conceptualizing quality initial teacher education within the European framework. Whereas here, in regards to this online context of teacher preparation, I haven't interviewed 3 management staff at the University of Pristina, 7 teacher educators, and I have also conducted a group interview with 15 student teachers. And as I introduced in the beginning, what I'm mostly interested to know is how would quality teacher education be conceptualized at the policy level, at the organizational culture and management level, as well as at the teaching and learning level. So using the hermeneutic circle, I wanted to understand different conceptualizations in terms of quality teacher education at these 3 dimensions. And as a result, I have also grouped the findings in terms of these 3 dimensions. And as I mentioned earlier, this is just a preliminary presentation of the findings. But anyways, there is a lot of room to discuss how quality initial teacher education is conceptualized within this changing context. So I will start with the first dimension on the policy level, and respondents could see quality initial teacher education in this changing context with the need of highlighting the need to transform the legal and policy infrastructure. Many respondents said that there is a need to ensure legal change as mandatory action, and there should be some development of a policy response mechanisms before jumping to implementation. And I think this is quite interesting because we understand that policy interventions are very important. However, this also an initial interpretation of this theme is that there is a highlight of this top-down approach in understanding or conceptualizing quality initial teacher education. So somehow here there's been a disregard of top-down, bottom-up, actions that could be taken in order to understand how could we ensure a quality initial teacher education. At the organizational culture and management level, there was a lot of emphasis on the need to ensure or engage in change management processes, which means we are still not prepared both at the institutional, the infrastructure and operational level, as well as at the normative level, which is the culture, the values, in order to understand this new context and actually implement it. So first of all, this transformation at the organizational, operational, as well as at the normative level was emphasized. However, here, one interesting finding that is worthwhile mentioning is the fact that there was this insisting on the fact that online learning and preparing teachers in this new context, it's only a temporary approach or a temporary context, which means there was no acceptance or general understanding that this is actually the new reality, and this might even be considered as an added value to ensuring quality teacher preparation. So this is again quite problematic at this level, because once we consider a context temporary, then it means we usually don't give the maximum effort to transform and actually internalize this new context. And finally, one of the most problematic findings in the dimension of teaching and learning is this rigidity and resistance coming from teacher educators as well as student teachers. As I mentioned previously, this was considered, after all, a temporary context. So for many, it was quite difficult to accept the fact that we should proceed further. One interesting finding in this regard is that for many, this new context, the online teaching and learning context, was the first encounter. So one aspect that was popping up in the findings was that there was a need to educate both parties, teacher educators as well as students, to actually embrace this new context. Another aspect which was also quite important is this dual pedagogy, which means in a normal, let's say, face-to-face environment, when you prepare teachers, you need to understand how to translate your syllabi, the learning outcomes, into an actual methodology of teaching. Whereas here, the dual pedagogy not only requires the translation of syllabi in didactic aspect, but it also requires the translation of the syllabi into the technical aspect. And this was quite interesting because this means that technology is not being used in a face-to-face environment, but we need to now use technology only when we teach online, which is again problematic and links to the fact that one of the findings also suggested that if teacher educators don't have the right pedagogy during a face-to-face context of preparing teachers, that would also negatively translate into this new context, into online teaching and learning, which means regardless of whether we consider this the new context or not, maybe teacher educators would always have the same approach of how they conceptualize quality teacher education, which means if they understand it as a traditional limited lecturing, then that would be also translated into the online teaching or preparing teachers in this new context. There was also this problematic aspect in the findings that there's a limited adaptability and lifelong learning mindset, which means regardless of this transitioning phase, we would still see teacher development as more knowledge-oriented or understanding-oriented dimension of the competence, whereas the skills and values are lacking somehow. And there is, finally, there was also problems coming up on the need for awareness, and also the need for ability to be adaptable to change. So more or less in this dimension, we could see a lot of tensions and contradictions, which somehow are not really different from the older context, if we could also consider the context as the previous one different. So somehow, if the understanding of teacher education is limited, it would also be limited while we are teaching in an online context. And here I try to theorize this understanding of the new context. And if we try to conceptualize context in a limited way, how you could also evidence this from the findings, that teacher educators would see the context as isolated, depending on their mindset and perspectives, and also their professional development. So what I'm trying to argue here is that if we want to conceptualize quality initial teacher education in a shared perspective, then we definitely need to ensure this expanding of the context in order to more broadly understand what context means. And in that way, we can actually understand all these tensions and contradictions, and then be able to maybe open up a bit in as to what we consider quality initial teacher education. So the argument here is that we need to actually treat context as a borderless ecosystem, which in this context, we would have the local context, the EU, the global context, which goes beyond that limited, isolated perspective of what do we consider quality initial teacher education, in order to actually better manage this transition and change setting, in order to enable a shared conceptualization of quality initial teacher education. And as a conclusion, we do understand that once we have, so education in general and teacher education trends are moving so fast, so in order to keep up with them, we all obviously need the regulatory element in the context of e-learning, the institutionalization of online learning. Then we need the infrastructure element, and in the context of e-learning means the adequate platforms, having an LMS, technological tools, and so on. We need the didactical element, which means the translation of adequate methodology in conducting lectures, organizing activities, developing competencies, assessing students. But more importantly, we need the culture element, which is this broader understanding, the broader context, which means the motivations, values, attitudes, and the mindset. This is the most critical aspects in this study, meaning what if this element is not actually in line or being influenced by all other aspects, we would definitely have some stagnation or problems in this regard. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions, please feel free to ask.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Fjolla, for your very interesting presentation. I cannot resist to start to say just one word, probably, that I'm probably in this group of people who are thinking that this way of learning, distance learning, is a kind of temporary solution or approach. And for me, this new terms, traditional didactics, e-didactics, and right didactics, oh, it's a bit problematic, I must say, because I don't really think, I think what is my concern is what we are actually losing with this, let's say, distance learning and teaching, especially in teacher training education. But yes, this is just my concerns, and I couldn't resist to share this with you. So please. start.
May I add something in this regard, Professor Hodnik? No, I definitely agree. And although I only presented just one element or one perspective, we understand that the face-to-face teaching cannot be substituted with any other approach. However, one of the problems that I find here is the resistance, because having this hybrid approach should be something that we should consider in the future. I definitely agree that there are many problems to it, and we can never substitute all the good things that would come with a face-to-face environment. But I think the bigger conclusion of the paper is that we should be more open to approaching new ideas and just try to test them and see how they would work, and then try to adjust according to the different contexts.
And maybe one more word. So hybrid system, I think it's not a very good one, because the students cannot adapt so quickly, you know. And this May, let's say in May, our students were not able to come back to the faculties because you need to organize yourself in a different way. So, okay, just stop here. I will give the word to Marco, please.
Well, Fjolla, thank you very much for your presentation. Again, it was for me thought-provoking and made me think about elements of your presentation. And I was wondering to what extent what you would think about adding another element to your 4 elements you had in your conclusion. And that's an element which is focused on learning and support. And I'm a bit triggered because you're talking about stagnation, about problematic, you're talking about rigidity, about resistance. And then I think, well, teachers are just humans, and they have been forced to really do something completely different they've never done before. They have no routines. So I'm not sure whether we should call it resistance or rigidity, or that we could say, well, they are uncertain and they don't know how to do it, and they need support, and we need to support teachers. So it's a way of how to label things and changes, or changes that do not happen. And for that reason, I thought, well, maybe another element need to be added about learning and support teachers that need to make that change.
Definitely agree. And as I said, this is just coming up with the preliminary findings, and there is a lot of data that we need to analyze further in this regard. But I definitely agree, and maybe I will try to add up to this comment, not only from what I have gathered in the from the data, but also being a teacher educator and also being with teachers during this time. It was quite difficult personally for me, but also for them. And actually, teachers felt a lot of pressure, and somehow they didn't know whether they can admit that this is a chaotic time, and it's quite difficult for them to cope with this change. So definitely, I agree that support and having this place where they can actually share their concerns and receive support and try to understand how to then go forward and go about it, it's something that was necessary for them.
Yes, I would maybe just say what I think my colleague Marco wanted to emphasize. How to label things is very important, you know, how to name it, you know, what this also shows the attitude, you know, towards teacher and people around. I think it's important, yes. Resilience instead of uncertainty. I think that is the big difference. Mm-hmm. So, other maybe comments? Questions? What do you mean by e-didactics? E-didactic. This is a new concept you are somehow thinking of, really? Can you say something about e-didactics?
Definitely. Well, it's actually quite open, to say the least. The e-didactics would mean using different tools, different techniques, but also having the attitude as a teacher and the skills in order to cope with all these elements. I actually recently was in a group of developing a manual, particularly in this regard, and having to write something which is practical to teachers in the e-didactics was quite a challenge, because you need to understand how would they, let's say, translate, first of all, the syllabi or the plan of the day in terms of this new learning context. How would they discuss with students? How would they organize activities? How would they ensure that they are assessing and measuring the development of or achievement of learning outcomes, as well as development of skills, values, and knowledge? So it's completely a new approach. And when we try to do that in a face-to-face context, somehow I feel that teachers have more control over it. Whereas in this new online teaching, they have so many aspects concerning the development of the competencies that they would need a lot of assistance, even more so than in a face-to-face environment. So if we discuss only in terms of developing future teachers, then you would need also the practical side, which I think for the practical side, teachers, it's one of the most important aspects of teacher education. So then e-didactics is again put into question when we don't have or cannot offer the practical side to future teachers or student teachers in this regard.
Also, the word practical is now challenging, because when we spoke about teaching practice at our university, our faculty, I didn't want to use the word practice. You know, for me, this is not teaching practice. If you have online teaching for the students, it's something else. It's something which is replacing teaching practice. This is
exactly as I said. So once you eliminate somehow or do not fulfill completely this practical side, then it's a question mark. You are not doing it 100%. You cannot replace the teaching practice in this online context. You can come close to it by doing some simulation, role playing, offering some videos and some other more, let's say, close to understanding how would teachers engage in that. But I definitely agree. We had the same in the faculty, and we were meeting with students via Zoom. So how would you replace that over sending students to an actual school and classroom? So I absolutely agree. It's quite problematic to actually call it practice.
Okay. Please, any other comments, thoughts? I think it's very provoking. I mean, your topic, a lot of different thoughts. I mean, okay. If not, maybe they come at the end. Okay, maybe we have some time at the end. And I would like to now announce the last presenter with very provocative, I would say, title: Do we need a curriculum in teacher education? Co-creating an innovative teacher programs together with schools. Our presenter is Snoek. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I'm Snoek, and together with a group of teacher educators and teachers from a number of schools in Amsterdam, we're working on a project, and I would like to tell something about that project. And it's as I mentioned in the title slide, it's reflections. It's not a research project, but it's a development project in which we encounter a number of issues and problems that I would like to share with you. So then the question is, to what extent it has actually anything to do with the COVID crisis and schools lockdown and distance learning, etc. So on the one hand, it doesn't have to do anything with it, but on the other hand, it has to do everything with it. Because if you think about the pandemic and the impact on education, you could look at different perspectives. You can look at what are needs of pupils and to what extent is are the opportunity to learning opportunities for pupils with high opportunities and with lower opportunities. How are these opportunities influenced? Or you can look at what are the opportunities of student teachers in having teacher practice, etc. But I would like to take the perspective a bit more from the teacher, and I think it relates to Fjolla's presentation and my remark on that. So how do we look at what teachers need to do in a period of a pandemic and the COVID crisis? And if we have an understanding of what teachers do need to respond to such a crisis, then the question is, so how does teacher education prepare teachers for that? So if I go to my slide, then if we look at the COVID-19 pandemic, we all saw that it had brought new challenges to schools and teachers. And one of the first things is that they really had to really adapt fundamentally their daily practice due to full and partial lockdowns, due to regulations, classrooms where you had only half of the students in the other half at school, the other half of the pupils at home. So that was urgent, and there was a constant need to adapt your daily work. And the question was also is how can we support students with different needs? Because teachers, I think, through the crisis and the homeschooling, were confronted with the fact that pupils had very different home backgrounds, and how can we offer and support to that difference? So that was a challenge for teachers. Then the other challenge was how to support students in developing their agency and self-responsibility to their own learning, because they were working at home. There was a teacher which was at distance, so there was much more agency and self-responsibility requested from pupils. And how can you support pupils in that? And to what extent can we strengthen teachers in taking leadership in curriculum redesign? Because it needed to be done by teachers. There were no educational designers who prepared everything for teachers. Teachers had to do it on spot. They had to redesign. They had to prepare online learning to create, but also be able to support colleagues in that. So teachers who were expert on digital learning became suddenly leaders in their schools to support their colleagues, or they could take leadership in social and collegial support. And some teachers also took leadership in reflections. Okay, what do we learn from this situation? So teachers were also expected and took the opportunity to take leadership in this rather turbulent times. As Evi Agostini already mentioned yesterday during the opening, we had a webinar on distance learning in pandemic times on the 15th of April, organized by Tallinn University and the TEPE network. And from that webinar, I took a few elements, and that was the conclusion that teachers need to share agency and authority with pupils and to support self-regulated learning of pupils. That teachers need to facilitate personalized learning paths for each student, and then teachers need to be creative in education and design, and must be able to design integrated and enriched learning activities. And whether it's on-site in schools or whether it's at the distance, but these are key elements. So actually, what I think the pandemic showed that teachers need a very high level of agency, creativity, flexibility, and design skills. And then the question is, to what extent do we prepare within teacher education students for that agency, for creativity, flexibility, and for design skills? So that's, for me, is one of the key questions, how to support these qualities within initial teacher education. And I think there's a paradox if we look at teacher education. And the paradox is in the fact that we have a very strong focus on quality requirements and accountability of teacher education institutes. And on the one hand, it is understandable that accountability and quality requirements, because we understand that teachers are key in the quality of education, and therefore teacher education is key in the quality of teachers. So on a governmental level, or maybe even on a European level, there's a very strong concern for the quality of teacher education. So that's one element. Another element is that also because of the focus on research, which is becoming stronger and stronger within teacher education, there's a very strong focus on evidence-based curricula. So we need to introduce students with outcomes from research and what we know about what works. There's a lot of discussion about what works, frameworks for teachers that need to be part of the teacher education curriculum. But with that focus on quality requirements, accountability, and on evidence-based curricula, it actually strengthens the agency of teacher educators in developing carefully designed teacher education curricula, which are full of elaborated learning activities for teacher students. And that's the work we do as a teacher educator. We really think about what are qualities, what qualities do we require for teachers, what do we know from evidence, and how can we create very elaborate curricula for our teacher students. So it strengthens the agency of teacher education. But the risk is that it reduces the agency of students, of student teachers, as goals, activities, and evaluation criteria are set by teacher educators or by national regulation. And that actually leaves little room and requires little room for agency from student teachers. So there's a paradox that on the one hand, we want to have that creativity, that agency of students, but if we create very carefully designed curricula, we might have a problem. But it has to do with how we understand the curriculum. You could say, well, the curriculum is the journey that a student teacher undertakes during initial teacher education, maybe before, maybe after initial teacher education. So that's one understanding of a curriculum. But another, and I think that's a more widely used understanding of the curriculum, is that's a planned sequence of instruction or a planned interaction of students with instructional contents, materials, resources, processes for evaluation, for evaluating the attainment of educational objectives. Especially that planning is done by teacher educators and not by students. This spider web is the curricular spider web from the Akker and Thijs, and it indicates that if you want to create a curriculum, you need to think about aims and objectives and content and learning activities and teacher role, materials, resources, grouping, location, time, assessment. But often the understanding is that teacher educators or teachers need to think about all these elements for their students. So the hypothesis actually that I have is that the more well-designed and planned the teacher education curriculum with evidence-informed method is, that the less student teachers need to think about their learning aims and quality criteria of their work. And that might impact their agency, creativity, flexibility, and design skills. And in that way, then if we look at the COVID pandemic, we might really lack some elements in the preparation of our teachers for such situations of the unexpected. So looking at the Netherlands, we do have teacher education programs, and I'm especially focused on the 4-year bachelor program to become a secondary school teacher in a subject. And within that context, there is limited freedom within the curriculum, both for student teachers and teacher educators, because we have nationally fixed competence requirements. We have a very detailed national knowledge basis, both on the level of general teaching skills and on subject knowledge. And these are assessed in national tests. We have exam boards that verify that exam protocols are followed. So the freedom for both teacher educators and student teachers is rather limited. At the same time, we see that there's a growing number of secondary schools who try to restructure their education. I think within the Netherlands, we have probably the highest level of pupils in secondary schools who is unmotivated for their schools and for their learning. So these schools are trying to thinking about how to restructure our schools, how to restructure our teaching in such a way that we strengthen the engagement, but also the agency of pupils in those schools. So the focus on strengthening student autonomy, that students have a voice in deciding when, how, and what to learn. And there's a great variety of schools who would use different concepts. Some are going very far. They don't say, well, there's no curriculum. We give all the trust and opportunity and possibilities to pupils to think about what do they want to learn. Other schools are less free on that. So we still have a structure, but still pupils have the room to decide when and how to learn. Schools focus much more on formative assessment and feedback instead of summative feedback. There is a stronger focus on team teaching of teachers. And actually these types of trying to shift responsibility and the agency to pupils ask for an ongoing redesign of learning environments. So you need to develop a learning environment that is challenging for pupils and that at the same time create support. But this requires a lot of agency, creativity, flexibility, and design skills of teachers that work in those schools. And the heads of those schools actually give the answer, well, if we look at teachers, newly qualified teachers from initial teacher education, they lack that, and they're not prepared to work in our schools. So that was a reason to think about how could we find an answer to this challenge from these schools and what teachers need in those schools. So what we try to do is to see, can we develop an experimental new teacher education program next to the existing ones in close collaboration with schools that is congruent with the approach in those innovative schools. So that actually our program is a kind of role model for what we expect those teachers to do in those innovative schools. But to what extent can we create autonomy for our student teachers? To what extent can they take collaborative responsibility in their learning process? And that actually asks for us a step back. Instead of designing carefully high quality teacher education curriculum, to create a learning environment where student teachers can set their own course. So what we try to create and what we aim to create is not a curriculum, but a challenging learning environment, where we have broad learning outcomes as guidelines and as a mean for student teachers to navigate their learning process, but to have them very broadly described and not have very concrete elaboration of what exactly do we expect you to deliver in terms of quality, because that should be a dialogue within the group of teachers, but also with other stakeholders. To have student teachers ask from school leaders or from pupils or for parents, what kind of quality do you expect from me? So that it focus on a multi-perspectivity. What are relevant quality indicators, and making that part of a dialogue with of student teachers, with teacher educators, but also with other actors in schools. And then to create the opportunity for self-defined activities in schools, where students are part of the school team. And that activity should both contribute to the broad learning outcomes, because that gives direction to students, to student teachers. It should contribute to the individual development states and ambitions of individual students. So what are their personal needs and ambitions? But it should also contribute to the needs of the schools. So it's relevant in the context of the schools, that schools have the student teachers have the feeling, okay, I'm part of this team of this school. And how can I contribute to the development and their aim to support pupils? So from the start, the 4-year program, the idea is that students are connected with one of the schools for a different school each year, for 2 days in the week, where they're part of the school team and contribute in the daily activities within the school. And at the same time, have a very strong support and guidance from teacher educators. So the aim is actually to create a constant dialogue with learning outcomes that focus on the teacher and society, teacher and pupil, teacher and subjects, teacher and school, and teacher and me. These are the broad themes that we want to cover. And within those group of student teachers, to create an attitude that almost on every activity that they undertake, they ask each other similar questions regarding to inquiry. What theory supports this? What kind of data support this? Multi-perspectivity. So what other perspectives are possible? If I step into the shoes of someone else, what new perspectives do I get? Can I understand that perspective? About coherence and connection. What are relations and what are patterns in the things I see within schools? Alternatives. Okay, we're doing it this way, but what if we should do it in another way? What new perspective would that offer? Relevance and values. If we're doing this, who benefits from it? And what values are key in that? And ambition. Okay, but what can I do to do it even better? How can I improve? We realize that if we want to do it in this way, that will require new skills from teacher educators, skills in coaching, and not being the guide, giving all the directions, but being much more coaching towards students, to have trust in students. And to be a gatekeeper, not so much by doing the actual assessment of students, but by assessing the assessment students that students, teachers set up themselves. We've started with a number of steps. We've started with a minor in this third year of the existing program, which is a 30-credit half-year program. We started in February. In September, we will start with a pilot in the first year with 24 credits. And we aim to start a full-year, four-year program in September 2022. And the first experience, this is a quotation of one of the students from the minor who is engaged at this time, is that the student said, well, this is the first time I feel I really am on during my study. I really feel, well, this is, now I'm really learning. At the same time, we realized that those third-year students, they have already had 2-year teacher education in a traditional way, and also secondary schools in a traditional way. So a detox period is necessary. How to unlearn the habits that they've been developed during the previous traditional school and study experiences. And we realized that quality is not found in structures and regulations, exam boards and things like that, but actually in the professionalism of teacher education. So we need a different way to understand how we focus on quality and safeguard and assure quality within teacher education, within the teacher education program, not so much to structures and regulation, but by supporting teacher educators to bring out the best. And of course, there are quite a lot of obstacles and opportunities. These are in the existing regulations. Exam boards, fixed program criteria, qualification requirements. So we have to adapt the program. We cannot go fully what we aim fully for our ambitions. We need to adapt to the existing programs. And sometimes that can be frustrating, but well, it's the steps we need to take. The second obstacle or dilemma is maybe even more complex, is how to adapt and include not only the general aspects of teaching, because I can really imagine how we organize a program like this when we focus on the general elements of teaching. But it's much more difficult when we also want to include the learning of school subjects. We're preparing students to become a teacher in history. Well, then you need a lot of history knowledge, and that's part of the curriculum. And how can we also create a much more flexible and student-regulated or student-directed approach in those school subjects? And I think one of the dilemmas we have is how to create or how to find a balance between freedom and autonomy of student teachers. And at the same way, to create enough structure that supports students and doesn't give them, well, leaves them almost swimming in the midst of the sea. So maybe, not sure whether you have questions for me. I have two questions for you. And one question, the first question is, do you recognize that paradox that I started with between well-designed curricula and how they might restrict the autonomy and agency of student teachers? You recognized it within your context. And the second question, to what extent are similar developments taking place in your country? And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Marco, for that this very interesting presentation. I have many comments, many things to say, but maybe I will save them and give the floor to others. Please, Vasileios, go start.
Thank you. I also have many comments, and it's very thought-provoking presentation. Of course, I personally understand what you mean between this paradox, and I wanted to raise the question. I mean, I have a context-related question because I was wondering to what extent you think selection of the candidates plays a role here, because I think sometimes, of course, you talk about the Dutch context. When I think about the Greek context, for example, I can say that there is a lot of contra-selection happening here, and many people don't, you know, they go to teaching for many reasons. And I mean, myself, I wasn't sure in the first or second year if that is really the path I wanted to follow in my teacher education program. So I'm wondering if, you know, people come with this kind of, let's say, low agency, so to put it like that, to what extent you can involve them in this process. I might assume that in context like in Finland or Singapore, where you have high stakes of selection, then perhaps it would make a lot of sense to be more democratic in this curriculum development process. So one question is about the selection, and then the other thing was, how would the fragmented nature of teacher education make this possible? So how would you negotiate with the subject? Or, I mean, you mentioned it as a challenge. How would you involve subject teachers there? Because again, when my students in Austria come in my teacher education classes, they sometimes come with a superstition well created from the subject that these courses we teach them are not so important, or they tend to come with this idea behind. So, and I wonder, like, to what extent can you also, do you negotiate the content? Because in Austria, this is a big thing. We think, so diversity, so students don't have enough info about the diversity, and I wonder if this is something you would negotiate. So I would be a person who would say we need more courses about that, for example, and I would claim that and wouldn't like to negotiate that. So these are some thoughts. Please.
Thank you, Vasileios. And I think they're very relevant questions, because these are questions we're struggling with too. Maybe to try to answer some of them. What I mentioned is that we wanted to start that program, and we really understand that it's a bold step we take, and we don't have any experience with it yet. We don't know whether it will work. So we understand it and label it as an experiment. And next to our experiment, there still are the regular teacher education programs. So we do have the opportunity to say, okay, we select students into this program, because we realize that what we need are the students who are willing to take up that responsibility, that feel challenged to take up the responsibility. They have a feeling, well, I didn't have enough opportunities to make my own decisions within secondary education. So we do realize this is not for every student. So we want to start small with maybe a group of 15 students, which we select quite carefully. At the same time, we think, well, by starting this program, we can experience elements of transferring autonomy to students that might be useful also within the regular programs. So we see it also as a kind of laboratory to think, okay, what can we learn from this for the regular teacher education program? So that's one thing. The fragmented nature and the role of the subject, that indeed is a very important element. We want to create a coherent program where all those elements, both the general pedagogical and didactical parts and the subject part, are more or less based on the same approach. So it should not be that they are part of subject courses which have a completely different attitude. I'm not sure whether we are able to succeed in that. One thing, at least, what we do is that we want to start very strongly with a very broad first year, which is mainly pedagogical and didactical, while the regular programs start very strongly with the subjects. So actually, we want to turn on the upside down the program, which traditional starts with very much subject matter and then more attention to pedagogy and didactics. We want to turn it on and upside down and start with a very pedagogical perspective of what does it mean to be a teacher, and then in the second part of the program give more attention to subject-related elements. So that at least was one way to try to create a common understanding with the group of student teachers.
And that was really interesting. That what I put down, that start with pedagogical perspective. I think that's very interesting. So I have Fjolla and also Jakob. I think someone put in chat. Please, Fjolla first.
Actually, I want to follow up on the starting with the pedagogical aspect, getting to know what is a teacher and what does it mean to become a teacher, and then allowing students to search for different subjects. I think it's quite interesting, and exactly as you said, it's like the opposite, because usually you would have, at least in our teacher education program, in the first years, you have more purely subject courses, and afterwards you would have this more subject didactics, and then maybe even more onto pedagogical aspect. And I wanted to actually ask the rationale behind this, because I think this is, again, very thought-provoking and interesting approach. The second follow-up is on regards to this flexibility. I think, again, most of the problems in regards to quality in initial teacher education come because we don't have much flexibility to test and see what works and what doesn't. So do you have some sort of regulatory element? Because during your presentation, you said that we don't believe that regulations should ensure quality teacher education, but the, let's say, grassroots level actions do. But my question is, do you have at least some sort of element? I don't want to label it regulatory, but some sort of framework that somehow balance everything up. And definitely thank you very much for your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for these questions. I think for the second question, we do indeed have quite a lot of regulations, and as we want our students at the end to have a recognized qualification as a teacher, we need to follow into these. However, we're looking on okay, where is the space to really adapt things? And I think the regulations are especially at the end of the program. So that's what criteria do they need to meet at the end? So that gives the opportunity at least to restructure things. And if the outcome is regulated, then the way in which students get to that outcome could be different. and could be even much more defined by students themselves. Still, we do have exam boards who want to make sure that we reach quality. So we're in constant negotiation in that. And then, well, that's a struggle, and that's an experiment. And for the other one, the rationale for the choice of pedagogy, I think for the regular programs, the rationale is that to start with the subject is that students in secondary education often have an interest in a subject, then think, okay, I would like to be a teacher in that subject. Based on that, they expect and they hope to see a lot of that subject in the first part of the study. And so I can understand that choice in the curriculum. What we would like to do is actually two things. First one is we want to attract a new group of student teachers who might not have already decided what subject they don't want to take. So it could be an opportunity for students who have not yet that very clear idea what I want to be a history teacher. So that's one thing. The second thing is that within the regular teacher education programs for secondary schools, there's a lot of focus on didactics, but there's much less focus on pedagogy, real pedagogy on child-centeredness, because it's much more subject-centered. So that's one of the things we want to create, especially in that first year, because the first year contributes very strongly to the identity of teachers. And we want to strengthen a pedagogical identity and not a subject identity. And finally, we are working within the context of Amsterdam with a lot of adversity and diversity in schools. And that's also an element that we want to bring in very strongly within the program. So to really think about what actually is the aim of education? What's my role towards pupils? How can I support them? And then the subject is only a mean in supporting pupils to get a good opportunities for a start in the rest of their life.
Yes, thank you very much for this. Maybe Istok, would you like to comment what you just sent in chat? Our Slovenian perspective, as I understood.
Yeah, I was just wondering if this crisis could be an opportunity also to be to empower teachers even more. I don't know if this could be a dependency because of this crisis, or I don't know if this is an opportunity actually to empower teachers that they can focus on their autonomy and their individual classrooms, and especially individual needs of students. So I don't know. That's maybe an opportunity also in the terms of crisis. I don't know.
I do agree with that. I think one of the I've been working very strongly on the concept of teacher leadership. So how to strengthen leadership of teachers. And when I look at initial teacher education, I think the concept of teacher leadership is only addressed in a very, very limited way. And I can understand that it's addressed only in a very limited way, because initial teacher education is mainly focused on supporting teachers to become sufficiently supported in how to arrange classroom learning. So it's very much, so in some way you could say initial teacher education is rather instrumental, how to support pupils in classroom context, how to support their learning, etc. But it's very much classroom focused. If you talk about this empowering teachers and their leaderships, it's across classrooms, and it's focusing on roles of teachers which are beyond the classroom. So I can understand that within initial teacher education, that focuses very strongly on the primary process of teaching in classrooms. At the same time, I really would like to see whether it would be possible to take that leadership elements much more prominently within the initial teacher education program. And that's something that we try to do within this program, how to strengthen those, these elements I mentioned, that agency and creativity and that ownership much more strongly within the program. And I'm not sure whether we will succeed with that, but that's at least something we try.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for all these questions. We don't have much time, all these presentations. What I would like to conclude, maybe to say only one sentence, that let's say the word full of opportunities for us. I think this is the way I would like to conclude. We are run of time. So thank you very much once more for all the presenters, and enjoy the conference in the afternoon and tomorrow as well. So thank you very much. Bye.